devil fruit earlier on is
Yo,
described by
check
Gans
two
as
one two.
forbidden fruit,
Good
essentially
morning.
making it the forbidden sun we have at home that us greedy humans still want to touch. And it's quite an unusual description. Devil fruits are spoken about with all sorts of hyperbolic bad language, but forbidden is a word that surprisingly rarely comes up. Furthermore, Ace's devil fruit even functioned as a miniature mother flame. As far as we know, the flame generation was essentially infinite, and Ace even used it to power some rudimentary engineering when he constructed the Striker. Then throughout the Second World, the sun is fought over, and in the depiction of what we suspect to be either the end of the Second World or a glimpse into the future that we have yet to reach in the Third World, a shadowy demon is grasping the sun, looking very similar to Doflamingo himself holding the flame fruit as factions from around the planet arrived to his Colosseum to fight for it. So if we were to move forward in time about 1,000 years and examine how this single day on Dressrosa was remembered, and say this legend is passed down and inspires a child to do a drawing, it would be bizarrely perfect for it to be drawn in the exact same way as the left-hand side of the Elbaf mural. Just replace the devil with Doflamingo, Nika with Luffy, and everyone else with everyone else. And I've highlighted this before, but there are very purposeful similarities that Oda has depicted between Emu and Doflamingo. Doflamingo's world noble heritage being paramount, however, his devil fruit ability allows Doflamingo to take control of people's bodies and command their actions, just as Emu's Domi Reversi allows, with both of these powers being temporary. However, Doflamingo also had access to an ability that mirrors the Mark of the Abyss, and that was through Sugar. Her hobby fruit powers formed a contract between Sugar's targets and Sugar herself. She can transform targets into toys and then dictate the terms of a contract, which must be adhered to by the toys, just as Emu can dictate the terms of his contracts. And just as with the Depths and Abyssal Covenants, becoming a toy also grants the target a form of immortality, a perpetual youth, which is also possessed by Sugar herself. In fact, Sugar's ability may even be more effective than the Mark of the Abyss, because we have yet to see a case of one of Sugar's commands being broken. The only exception to this is when Sugar does not establish a contract, like when she forgot with Toy Soldier Kyros, who maintained his free will even in toy form. So Doflamingo, very bad man, he had a plan to gather representatives from all around the world and put them under a contract that takes away their free will. And I'm not going to say that's exactly what happened with Emu's Mark of the Abyss, but it does sound quite close. Emu was able to assemble 19 other kingdoms and mark many of their royalty with his contract, thus putting them under his control and becoming the big ruler of the world guy. And it's also been noted for quite some time now that Emu speaks in a very childish way in Japanese. We don't really pick this up in English because Emu, he uses a lot of old and very florid Shakespearean language, which is difficult to reconcile with his childlike nature. But Emu, he is a child out of time, which is why he sounds like an ancient grandpa to us. But there are two characters in the One Piece world who also possess Emu's childlike way of speaking, one of which is Miss Golden Week of Baroque Works, whose Colors Traps ability functions as a budget Mark of the Abyss, but also the aforementioned Sugar. She's actually 22 years old, however her aging was frozen when she consumed her devil fruit as a child. And as a result of that, Sugar has never really had to grow up, which is why she still acts like a child. So we have two perpetually youthful children forcing contracts to create a solid power base. And with that in mind, it's almost as if Doflamingo deliberately engineered his crew, his kingdom, and his Colosseum plan based solely on plagiarizing what Emu did, right down to the idea of creating a void century. Because the most nefarious aspect of Sugar's ability is that once a target is turned into a toy, anyone who knew that target immediately loses all of their memories of them. So Dressrosa even has its own void century happening. It is more of a void decade because that's when Doflamingo took over the country, but in the words of the great Nefertari Cobra of Alabasta, a country is its people. And if the memories of the people are being erased, then the history of Dressrosa itself is being erased. When someone becomes a toy, their memories vanish. When someone becomes a toy, they become Lelucia Kingdom. They never existed. And furthermore, it was said that Dressrosa is a kingdom divided into the forgotten and the forgetters. But just like the real fictional world, not all evidence was able to be erased. The statue of Kyros is evidence of this. This is like stumbling across a poneglyph in the greater One Piece world. It is evidence of a legendary history that nobody remembers for some reason. A hero of a time long forgotten, and coincidentally, or I suppose fatesomely, Luffy ends up dressing just like the statue of Kyros. Luffy, or I guess Lucy, appears on Dressrosa looking exactly like their forgotten hero in the same way that he appears in the world now, looking like Joy Boy and the sun god Nika. Emmet even mistook Luffy for Joy Boy, and Emmet knew Joy Boy pretty well. And Luffy's Gear 5th form does resemble the Elbaf deity of Nika, so I guess we can add Kyros to the list of legends that Luffy has unintentionally imitated and or become. Plus, the key to victory on Dressrosa was stated to be to restore the lost memories of the country, which is also what we're working towards for the very end game of One Piece, to discover the truth of the Void Century and to unvoid it, to remember the way that this planet used to be. And this is going to sound like a bit of a stretch at first, but Doflamingo even had his own 5 elders serving under him in the Colosseum. Senor Pink, Dellinger Lao, G. Muck Vice, and Diamante. Gats announced them as guardians charged with defending the prize, the flame fruit. Not that anyone except for Diamante actually ended up serving this role, and even he did a pretty terrible job at it. But as I've noted on this channel before, Oda has also used a very similar shot of Doflamingo's top officers bowing to him, which is drawn in the exact same way as later on the 5 elders would bow before Imu, with Doflamingo's instance occurring in chapter 782, titled Champions of Evil, which is what the 5 elders effectively are. And this is not a coincidence at this point. Doflamingo, he was a mini Emu. He was an Emu beta test. And what happened on Dressrosa is exactly what we are going to see on a much larger scale in the final war. To go back to the Harley text, another key line from the First World is, the enslaved prayed and the sun god appeared, which so far you can and should equate to the toys. However, a more appropriate and very, very neglected aspect of Dressrosa is the existence of the prisoner gladiators. We fight and fight until the day we're killed for all to see in the ring, and it's all because we looked at the Doflamingo family the wrong way. His Royal Highness says we'll be free if we win 1,000 battles, but even the greatest warrior will still lose before his 100th battle to the death. Everyone who tried to escape was shot to death. There's no escape for us. It's an extremely depressing aspect of One Piece, because all of these guys, they're all missing limbs, multiple limbs. They've got all sorts of holes in them. These gladiators are actually so wounded that Luffy mistakes them for mummies. And the way that Doflamingo was using the prisoner gladiators was in the same manner that the world nobles would use their own slaves for their native hunting contests. Those contests even came with the same sense of false hope. In Doflamingo's case, he said, yeah, you win 1,000 battles to the death, you'll be free. Impossible. Meanwhile, the world nobles told their slaves that all you need to do is survive a couple of weeks and you'll be free, both of which were impossible conditions to meet. And on Dressrosa, the enslaved prayed, and the sun god did indeed appear before them. Granted, they attempted to kill that sun god, but according to Luffy, that's okay because he's still alive. However, originally, the gladiators' hope was for Rebecca to win the tournament, acquire the flame fruit, and use its power to defeat Doflamingo. So whether the prisoner gladiators knew it or not, they were praying for a sun god, a Nika-like figure to save them. They just thought that that hope was Rebecca with those flamey sun powers, as opposed to Luffy or arguably Sabo, who did eat the flame
Let me
fruit
try and move
did
the
liberate the Colosseum. The prisoner gladiators
camera,
also told Luffy,
perhaps.
what you saw was the world of light, of the winners. Doflamingo separates everyone into the obedient winners and the rebellious losers, just like the world government itself. So we have a direct comparison there, but elsewhere, Kyros also has something interesting to add to this idea. About Doflamingo, he says, he attempts to bury that rebellious will in the shadows, but that simply means there is a rage and rebellion brewing within the darkness of this land. And it is the number of tragedies that holds the key to our operation. Kyros essentially saying that Doflamingo is going to be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of tragedy that he has caused. Not internally overwhelmed, like emotionally. Doflamingo's not going to go, oh, I feel so bad about all the things that I've done. It's more so that he's pissed off so many people and made so many enemies that that force is going to overwhelm him. And that is the exact same idea for the world as a whole via the Will of D. The story of the Will of D is one of compounding tragedy. We have yet to see a Will of D member who met a natural conclusion to the end of their lives. However, each of these tragedies then laid a piece of the foundation for the future, with the Will of D becoming more and more powerful until we reached Roger's tragedy, which allowed the commencement of the Great Age of Piracy, which is what will allow Luffy to finally fulfill the Will of D. And it is the sheer number of tragedies
Cool, that looks a lot better.
in the last 800 to 900 years that is going to hold the key to the dawn of the world. And speaking Speaking of the Will of D, Dressrosa also has its own small-scale equivalent, with Doflamingo having manipulated the entire country into hating the Riku dynasty. Doflamingo positioned himself as a savior of the country, just as Imu did through the world government on a global scale, and Doflamingo ensured that the Riku bloodline would be reviled and feared as a bearer of curses, bad fortune, and all sorts of, other negative adjectives and such. Everyone despised Rebecca simply because of her lineage, not because she did anything wrong. She was just unfortunate enough to bear the will of Riku, and had Rebecca not lived in the same era as Luffy, she almost certainly would have suffered a tragic Will of Riku ending just as the D-Wielders do. Doflamingo, the heavenly demon, fabricated a series of demons to hate to mask himself, the true demon. And one other very integral factor that I feel the need to mention is Gyat. Not many people remember Gyat, and that's a shame. He was the Carter Coliseum commentator, and within this microcosm, he played the role of Big News Morgans. It was Gyat's commentary that colored every contestant. His words alone could change the public opinion on any given fighter. And he's nowhere near as manipulative as Morgans is, but Gyat had the same power nonetheless. His commentary was being broadcast on screens all around the entire country, and it is also his commentary right at the end of the arc that rallies every remaining fighter who did not originally join Luffy. The dude even gets a whole chapter named after him at 786, and in chapter 789, Gyat hypes up Luffy, stating his achievements in the Colosseum, and gives a dramatic countdown to his return. Plus, Gyat is also the one who announces Doflamingo's defeat, and he does so with a very, very important speech. Look into the sky, Dressrosa. What you see vanishing is not just the birdcage, it's the end of Doflamingo's rule. And the scene you're witnessing beyond the cage is not just a diced up town, but a place devoid of manipulation. A land of freedom. Gyat is announcing the Dressrosa equivalent of the dawn of the world. And Big News Morgans will likely have the honor of doing the same on a global scale. I mean, I say honor, he will take that honor for himself because he's smart enough to read the way that things are going, as well as accurately judge the yearning for freedom held by the world at large. And so to move their hearts as effectively as possible, Morgans will likely be our Gyats. We walk into the One Piece world with Morgans against us, like Lucy walking into the Colosseum with Gyats. But over time, Luffy has impressed Morgans more and more, and eventually Morgans is the kind of guy who will have the power to rally every nation, faction, or individual not currently aligned with Luffy and compel them to act in the final war. And the Marines even have a symbolic role here as well. There was a huge Marine presence on Dressrosa, and Admiral Fujitora made the decision to bet on Luffy, which is exactly what the Marines as a whole will likely choose to do in the final war, or at the very least a considerably large faction of them. But Dressrosa isn't just a case of here's a step-by-step diagram of what's gonna happen. The dawn of the world is already happening, present tense. The formation of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet represents that small-scale union of the world. You've even got crazy dynamics happening like the healing of the relationship between the Long Arm and Long Leg tribes, with Ideo and Blue Gilly deciding to form a crew together, and the tales from the entire Grand Fleet now has the entire planet contracting Luffy like a relentless STI. So the dawn of the world, it has well and truly begun. It is spreading, although we are still in the very early stages, but Dressrosa, and specifically the Carter Coliseum, is the moment that changed everything. And this will certainly not be remembered by history, but in the end, it is all thanks to the arrogant ambition of a singular, flamboyant flamingo.
Just had time.
Walmart Express delivery comes in as fast as an hour,
We can order tacos.
so you can get to dinner quick and skip the daily doom scroll.
Tacos, you said?
Already?
Always a step ahead, that guy.
Who knew?
So many stars are in the making at SCAD. Students like you, finding their inspiration in 100 creative degree programs. And with lifelong career support for alumni, SCAD makes it possible for you to say, I made it here.
What is the longest fight in One Piece? Luffy versus Katakuri? Long as it may be, it only lasted 19 chapters, which pales in comparison to Luffy versus Doflamingo clocking in at 33 chapters, and even that feels short when we look at Luffy versus Kaido, which took place over 42 chapters and well over a year of real-world publishing time. And that is somehow still not the longest fight in One Piece, because I am reliably informed that 42 is a lower number than 43, and 43 chapters is the length that the two most hard-boiled of manly men spent dueling one another. They entered the battlefield as enemies, but left as sworn brothers in one of the most unique bouts in all of shonen manga. This is the one-of-a-kind tale of Frankie versus Senor Pink, which even to this day, this fight is a bit controversial among the more vocal of One Piece fans on the internet. You've got those who absolutely love it and those people who think it was a complete waste of time. I personally belong to the former category, and I've now spent more time than any human ever should have making this video to explain why that is. However, I do certainly understand where controversy arises because, as mentioned, this is one of, and in fact, I think it may be the single most unique fight in the series, and unique fights come with unique tastes, some of which may initially offend the tongue, and if that's you, then I now invite you to rip off your nearest bikini top and wipe your mouth with it. And tell me how you feel after you did it, because I'd hazard a guess that you're feeling pretty damn hard-boiled. This may or may not be immediately apparent given the baby aesthetic of Senor Pink, but his design was inspired by Chow Yun-fat, specifically his character from A Better Tomorrow, where he can be seen lighting a cigarette with what I believe to be 100 United States dollary dues. This was the character that young Senor Pink was based on. However, his philosophy came from another Chow Yun-fat film titled Hard Boiled, during which his character protects a baby during a gun battle. And in fact, the poster of Chow Yun-fat holding the baby in question may have been the direct inspiration for modern Senor Pink's design. Hard Boiled is essentially the lifestyle of not showing any emotion, being as cold as possible because nothing can penetrate your hard-boiled shell. This is why Senor Pink does things like brushes his teeth with a shoe brush, uses brandy to disinfect his wounds, and wipes tomato juice from his mouth with a bikini that he rips off the girl closest to him at the time. It's a comical exaggeration of that hard-boiled archetype. And hard-boiled even has its own literary genre, which usually takes the form of crime fiction with a grizzled, downtrodden detective hard on the case to stop some sort of
James
crime.
Patterson.
It was also very prevalent in stuff like 80s action movies, which is where Frankie comes into this dynamic, as Eiichiro Oda is a huge, huge fan of the Terminator. He even has a life-size movable Terminator statue in his office, and Frankie is his Arnold Schwarzenegger homage to this love. And something that I feel can really unlock this fight for those who didn't initially take to it is to understand that this entire fight is a parody. It's not supposed to be a serious, straight-up punch battling encounter. This is not a Zoro fight, it is a Frankie fight. Frankie and Senor Pink spend the entire fight trying to one-up each other in being hard-boiled, but in doing so continuously display their soft-boiled qualities, like the classic Frankie quirk of acting all tough, then being immediately overwhelmed by emotion and playing the guitar. The joke is that both Frankie and Senor Pink act like these hyper-masculine, manly men, whilst both of them have such ridiculous, not at all manly quirks. Senor Pink wears a diaper, Frankie has light-up nipples, and all of Senor Pink's attacks are named after cute little kitty cats like the Niku Mini Punch and the Nyan Nyan Suplex. So the key contrast here is that these two are the epitome of manliness, and yet they're the two craziest weirdos on the island at the time, possibly even in the world at the time. Each of them with an extensive suite of quirks which would traditionally immediately see them both become outcasts. And one of the core struggles during the fight is the attempt to outman one another, as Frankie and Senor Pink constantly refer to the other as, quote, boy, to artificially raise their own status as the pinnacle of man. However, as I often say, Eiichiro Oda is a master of contrast. Very rarely does he go in and do something tunnel visioned. And given that this is a parody fight, Oda also chose to contrast that comedy with a great deal of genuine heart. And this is even before Senor Pink's flashback. For example, when Sugar gets knocked unconscious by Usopp and the rest of the Don Quixote family are horrified that all of their toy slaves are returning to normal, Senor Pink's only response is, I only hope she's not hurt. And at another point during the fight, Frankie briefly distracts the Senor Pink by claiming that he heard an old lady in an alley that needs help, which Senor Pink falls for. Although after discovering that he was tricked by this clever ruse, Senor Pink says, there ain't no old ladies that need help, which is a relief, don't get me extremely wrong. And Senor Pink even stops mid-fight to save a cat, which makes Frankie cry a singular manly tear. This character has a surprisingly big heart, and that only endears you further to the comedy, because as he continues to do weird and wacky things, it becomes like laughing along with a friend. And I do know that a lot of people challenge the notion of Senor Pink being a good guy, particularly because his job on Dressrosa was to enforce the continued domination of turning people into toy slaves. And to that I say, it's fair enough. I do think that there can often be a bit of a conceptual disconnect with Oda's characters and their actual actions in the series, which is something that not even the Straw Hats are immune to. In retrospect, it's a little bit horrifying what Nico Robin did as well, willingly assisting the beginning of a civil war that killed thousands of civilians. And even Frankie was a massive prick when we first met him, and he beat the living crap out of Usopp. But my general rule of thumb is that if we can love Robin after everything she's been a part of, then we've got space in our hearts for Senor Pink as well. Which is something that the crowd of this fight also goes on to realize. Senor Pink, he has his bikini girls, and Frankie, he has his Tontada yelling words of encouragement. However, after a certain point, both sides end up being emotionally taken in by the sheer quantity of manliness on display. The bikini girls start to admire Frankie, the Tontada start to admire Senor Pink, and comedic as it may be, this battle turns into something much greater than the specific situation of what's happening on Dressrosa. Yes, both sides have a mission, but this fight transcends all of that, and we are watching the pinnacle of men fight for the very concept of what it is to be a man. It's important to note Oda's use of crowds because he often has onlookers. They generally serve the purpose of exposition, but they also generally take the position of readers and watchers and tell us who we should be rooting for. But in this rare case, Oda muddles all of that. The crowd themselves become confused, and I think that reflects us as readers, because I started this fight rooting for Frankie, but I ended it wanting neither of them to lose. And one key reason why this is because there is an incredible Senor Pink flashback about the death of his son Gimlet and now vegetative wife Rush, which to this day is something that I point to as one of Oda's greatest twists of genius. To be able to take an obese man in a baby outfit and make me feel legitimately emotional about why he wears it, because it is the only thing that makes his vegetative wife smile. And when he says
He's the reason why his wife is a vegetable. Senor Pink is a horrible person.
I'm just gonna say, Senor Pink has a better backstory than Kaido. Although crazily enough, Oda wasn't planning on putting Senor Pink's flashback in the series at all. It was his editor at the time who insisted that Oda put this story to page after hearing about the backgrounds that Oda had written for Senor Pink. And as a side note, Oda once again managed to make the battlefield very relevant, and in this case, very much thanks to his editor, because Senor Pink was guarding the Smile Factory, which was very apt, as his whole personality.
Senor Pink was a horrible person.
Guarding the smile of his wife, Rush. This man is
He's the
guardian
reason
of
why,
smiles, and
because he kept on
context,
lying to
it's
her. He was a
very easy to
gangster.
get on board with his over-the-top diaper-related stoicism. I might be wrong, but I also believe that this is the only turn-based combat fight in all of One Piece, by which I mean Frankie and Senor Pink almost never fight at the same time. They continuously take turns hitting the other one as hard as possible as a continuous display of how hard-boiled they are. And Frankie's reasoning for this is, quote, when you're offered drinks at the bar, a man doesn't take his glass off the table. While Senor Pink's reasoning is, don't get the idea, little boys. My swim fruit powers don't exist for the purpose of running from the enemy. I swim when I want to swim. Although both Frankie and Senor Pink do use underhanded tactics from time to time, like Pink's sneaky diaper bombs and Frankie's lie about the old ladies needing help, but they're never malicious tactics. It's not something like Charlotte Flampe shooting Luffy, no. Everything done by Frankie and Senor Pink always falls well within the realm of sportsmanship. And having just brought up Charlotte Flampe, this fight does have its own mini Flampe moment, an interruption which puts both combatants on the same mental wavelength. As one of the more perplexing moments of this fight is when the Smile Factory manager Kewin appears and becomes entangled in the fight, during which point Frankie decides to suddenly kiss her. So I don't watch a lot of reaction content on YouTube, but this is one of the things that I will go out of my way to search for, which is episode 693. And I've encountered a lot of people who see this moment as a bit of a waste of time, almost like inserting canon filler, but this moment is actually everything, as Senor Pink states Frankie's reasoning for him. Don't blame him, manager. It's your fault for getting involved. When a woman tries to interfere in a fight between men, how else should she be silenced? At which point, Frankie joins in. A young lady shouldn't get all worked up over a measly kiss or two. You said it, falling in love with a kid, I'd get a nasty hangover. And after this moment, Frankie and Senor Pink are completely and beautifully in sync. Any differences they had no longer exist. And this is the turning point where Senor Pink's fangirls say for the first time they're both so hard-boiled. This is the incident that allowed Frankie and Senor Pink to understand and respect one another, and from this point on, it was not a fight between two enemies, this was a battle between two men. And I'd also like it noted that the factory manager does appear much later on in One Piece. During Capone Gangbeja's cover story, she goes on a bit of a kissing rampage, having had her life changed by the words of Frankie and Senor Pink, and combining it with her innate vacuum powers to knock people out with a single kiss, a scourge of Dressrosa. But this is easily the best thing to happen to Frankie in the entire post-time skip era. Not the kiss specifically, but this overall fight. Something that initially drew me to One Piece was how each member of the Straw Hats fought in their own unique style with their own unique code. Like Zoro fighting with 3 swords and with the philosophy of doing everything he could to avoid getting a scar on his back, the great shame of swordsmen. Or Sanji choosing to fight exclusively with his feet to preserve his hands for cooking. Every crew member has their thing it is they do, but some crew members have definitely kept up with that better than others. And Frankie to me is a bit of an unfortunate case of Oda not quite keeping up with what he initially put out there. Yeah, Frankie's gotten a lot of cool cyborgy mech-related showcases, but what we are often missing from him is that core element of Frankie perversion. The best way I think you can summarize it is with a pun. The fact that whenever Frankie is about to transform or do something cyborgy in any way, he yells hentai, meaning great transformation, but also obviously it can also mean pervert. And because he's a jacked dancing cyborg man in Speedos, everyone just assumes that he's outing himself as a pervert. That's the gag, and to me that is the core of Frankie. The pinnacle of weird and wacky within a certain niche that even Luffy can't access. That's what made me love Frankie, and all of the qualities I enjoyed about the fight with Senor Pink were also present during Frankie's Sea Train fight against Nero. This was the first time that we got a solid shot of exactly what it is that Frankie brings to the table, with supreme abilities like Frankie Invincible, where he just slides down, and of course the unforgettable Frankie Centaur, which is actually a reverse centaur and was thought to be useless before Frankie used it fiendishly to finish Nero off. I feel like over time, the fact that this is one of the weirdest men to have ever lived often gets a bit downplayed or even outright forgotten in One Piece. And a lot of Frankie's fights and even general interactions tend to be played pretty straight. It's a little bit like the Austin Powers effect. There's the whole joke of the first film that Austin Powers is the ugliest man on screen at all times, and yet he is the most irresistible man in the world. But by the third movie, the initial joke is worn off. You're desensitized to the character, and so all of his strange quirks just feel normal now. And because we've been with Frankie for so long, I think a similar effect has happened to him, which
Alright.
means that Oda needs to work extra hard to push Frankie's greatest qualities, which is why I love the fight with Senor Pink.
I'll be
During this
back.
battle, Frankie is
I have to go get some breakfast.
his potential. Senor Pink is an innate. Frankie and Senor
Okay.
Pink finally making good on that promise to have a drink one day, with Frankie clearly being moved by the story of Senor Pink's past, and one rather heartbreaking little detail happens to be the cocktails they're both drinking, which is a gimlet, a simple mix of gin, lime, and sugar, and also the name of Senor Pink's tragically lost child. And Frankie does also mention Senor Pink during Eckert Island. After seeing S Shark use Senor Pink's devil fruit abilities, Frankie jumps to the conclusion that he died, which is a reasonable thing to do, but he is beyond relieved to hear that his brother is still alive and well. And look, a day will come where the Straw Hats will disband and everyone's gonna have to go their own separate ways. And when that day comes, I believe that Senor Pink might become part of the Frankie family. Because where else would be a better home for your brother than the family house?
Egg, 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 egg.
That's it. Do with that what you will, I guess.
Every time you said hard boiled, soft boiled, hard boiled.
I see what
It's
you're
like
doing. I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing.
egg. I couldn't let go of it from the very beginning. It was all egg. You still recording?
No,
This is the first time I've seen his wife, I think.
Usopp is a tontara, and not just that, but also another thing that far, far too many people have missed. So you let me.
All right, yeah, I'll be back. Give me one
Chapter
second. Let me go pick up my breakfast.
1139, the mystery of Lava Scopacaban stated there are many blood races throughout history.
Good morning. Thank you for joining my live. I'm just taking a quick second right now to settle down. I just got some breakfast and stuff. So, this breakfast. I am going to actually get some water as well. Clean my area real quick. Glue gun away. I have so much stuff around. Uh, 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 uh. I gotta take this vitamin C twice a day, starting because of my surgery coming up. Let me see. I like my YouTube videos.
Donna, the lowlands and lowlands and the lowcats. These blended peoples don't tend to last
I got a lot of
long.
things
Every
going
year
on.
there have always been
In my
those who
face.
are open. This was the first time that we'd heard this particular explosion. It would not be the last question. Well, who exactly are they? The question was asked in the SBS of Volume 112. Question. Hello, Otis. What are the Dosandada tribe? Are they a tribe of mixed race between giants and dwarves? Hence, quite close. The correct answer is mixed race between humans and dwarves. The name of the dwarves tribe, Tonatata, came from the cute sounds of their footsteps. If you raise that sound volume a bit more, it becomes a Dosandada. And the mixed race between a giant and a dwarf is the Zushin Dodo tribe. They're very so it was not giants and dwarves. It wasn't dwarves and humans. They are the Dosandada. After discovering this information, the eyes of many men on the internet started to scour the series for any potential Dosandada sightings. And they didn't get very far, because in chapter 41 we see a flashback of Usopp's mother Banchina, whose nose looks suspiciously exactly the same as the noses of the vast majority, but not all of the Tontada tribe introduced on Dressrosa. Banchina's nose is even quite different to Usopp. He's more of a, a long cylinder. It's two cylinders. But Banchina has
Sorry.
creating well over 1,000 named characters. This sort of nose is actually very different. In fact, long noses in general are very unusual in others. That's for short and sharp, Sparrow, and how long Foxy and Sharp remains with King.
Soga King. Ooh.
What
The
happened?
Tontata tribe, the only long nose I can think of off the top of my head is Kapu, that's for short, Sparrow, and Arlong, and Foxy, and Charles Relay, and so King.
What the heck? Oh, it's because I am on the bad Wi-Fi. Hi, thank you for joining. I'm just getting my area clean. Clean my area up a bit. Hang this up. Okay, bet. It's still on.
Gee, didn't you see Usopp, Big Fish, impersonating Usopp in that one game I've forgotten? Let's just say what. Okay, so long noses aren't anywhere as rare as I initially thought they were, and yet I haven't even mentioned the big one. The big one being Mr. Blackbeard. Oftentimes, consistent teeth, but what we should be focusing on
Is his teeth? Is his nose?
consistent nose. 3 times get Blackbeard. Always has a
Yeah,
wide,
yeah.
exclusive nose, but
I'm
most
so
times
hungry.
get red noses.
Hopefully this is seasoned.
To the point where he would have a nose as a Here's the reason why Blackbeard has a long nose, because he's a bad man. And evil characters tend to be given what are considered to be ugly features, like your classic long-nosed witch. That also happens to be why Katarina Devon, Vasco Shop, Perisphero, Arnold Kapu, and Brule was the long noses, because they all started their tenure in One Piece as villains, and most remain as villains. So look, I'm a lot less interested in all of them, because I understand the thematic nature behind those choices. However, what I am very interested in are good characters who are given this feature biography, because there is a certain connective tissue that these other characters don't have. All of the people I mentioned just then, what I will say for all of their noses is that they're all their own unique kind of aberrations of nature. They don't follow a uniform schnoz. However, there are characters in One Piece who I immediately thought of when I re-examined the Top style nose, and they would be Mozu and Kiwi of the Frankie family. If you need help telling them apart, Mozu is the one dressed like a kiwi fruit, and Kiwi is the one not dressed like a kiwi fruit. In any case, they have the Banchina nose, also known as the Tontada nose, and so my proposal would
That's
be that
decent,
Mozu, Kiwi,
but
Banchina, and by genetic association,
all of it's cold.
may be descendants of the Tontada family. They could be Dosendadas, the mix between humans and dwarves. And with that in mind, Usopp's role on Dressrosa becomes a lot more interesting to examine. The Tontada tribe have a curious amount in common with Usopp, but in many ways they're also the total opposite, particularly when it comes to communication. With Usopp being a prolific type of
Huh.
For example, when Leo was interrogating Robin stitched his nose and made friends with her, because why would anyone lie? Making this a phenomenal Robin face in the process. Plus, there's also a pretty fantastic part where Leo gets captured by Treble and interrogated about his other allies. And after initially refusing to give Treble any names, Treble says, "But he's my friend." What's his name again? Leo then smiles and names Usopp, I guess Usoland, thus giving away his friend. As Treble said, his friend was his friend, and why would anyone lie? So not only are they gullible, but the Tontara tribe are probably completely incapable of lying. They are honest to a fault. Again, the opposite of Usopp. We'll get more into this in a bit. But Usopp's lesson on Dressrosa is less one about bravery and more one of honesty. Usopp's lies began as a defense mechanism, and to this very day he lies and acts all tough in order to conceal his crippling fear. Which isn't all that dissimilar to the Tontada tribe. The Tontada do mostly rely on trickery to get by. They prefer to stay hidden and take advantage of their speed to deceive targets or opponents into believing that they're dealing with some sort of overwhelming supernatural force. Which very much reminds me of Usopp lying about his 8,000 loyal men to project that same sort of power. The The difference, I suppose, is that the Tontara tribe practice more honest deception, if that makes sense. Because the whole reason of why they did this right is because the Tontara tribe made a deal with the Riku dynasty to pretend to be fairies. And with that status, they can acquire, aka steal, any resources they need from Dressrosa. Lying isn't always a bad thing, and in the case of the Tontara, it is a mutually agreed upon lie that sustained their civilization for 800 years. Whilst the Tontara, like Usopp, do act tough, but they're quite emotionally weak. They will laugh, cry, get scared, get anything. They will feel absolutely all of the things at the slightest hint of a mood shift or even a false suggestion. Their entire society is quite childish as well. I mean, I don't know, childish might be the wrong word, but they do all have this childlike innocence. Further connection to Usopp insects, rhinoceros, beetles, hornets, and transport at the Tontara airport, which Usopp goes crazy for because he loves insects, as does Luffy. And not only that, but Usopp's connection goes a bit deeper because he was trained by Heracles, a man perpetually dressed as a beetle. These small connections are not an accident. Even more so than the giant's Velbath, who Usopp admires above all others, the Tontara tribe almost feels like it was designed for Usopp. And so it's very fitting that he goes on to become one of their legendary heroes, as one of the many lies that Usopp tells the tribe is that he is
I think I might actually just end the live.
And I love how Leo
Because I am about to go crazy. I'm hungry.
Who came to our kingdom 400 years ago. Some bad guys were messing up our island, but he came to the ancestors' side and helped us win the battle. He's a legendary hero to all Toranas. As part of this,
Yeah, I'm gonna end the live for right now. I'll be back. I am not drawing anything, actually. I'm just cutting this out. I'm cutting out a stencil. I apologize. Thank you. I'm really hungry. I will be back though, but I'm gonna end this live because I do not want to be eating and munching on the mic.